We are going to look at the Q text edit component, and this is a component that allows you to type multiple lines of text in your user interface, something like this. And I am sure you have seen this in a lot of graphical user interface applications. So what we are going to do is to set this up in a demo Qt application using PySide, of course. And we will be able to type in the text, get the current text in this component like we did for Q line edit, but we can do much more. For example, we have the capability to copy text, to cut text, to paste text. We can undo and redo, something you see in a lot of text processing applications, and this is going to be really cool. To set this up, it's nothing really special. All you have to do is to use the Q text edit component. You will set this up in a widget that we will set up in a short while when we hit Visual Studio Code. And we will set up a bunch of buttons that are going to allow us to manipulate things in our text edit component. One thing I want you to see is that, for example, to copy text from our text edit component, we are not going to go through separate slot methods like we did before. What we will do is take advantage of the fact that the text edit component itself already has a slot that is going to copy data. So instead of delegating to a custom slot that we set up in our own application, we will immediately call the copy slot in our connection here. And this is something you might want to do in your Qt application. Apart from that, it is standard stuff we have been doing all along. And it's really not going to be anything complicated. Now that you know this, we can head over to Visual Studio Code and play with us a little more. Here we are in Visual Studio Code. We have an empty folder that we will be playing with in this lecture here. Let's drag and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code. We will close this and create our main py file, py, I mean. Let's do that, and we will create our widget file like we always do. And in our widget, we will put in our starter code. This is going to create a starter widget, which is empty. And notice the imports we do here for the things we will be needing here. So it's quite a lot. Make sure you put these things in. Once we have this in, we will head over to our main file and put in the code that needs to be there. It's just going to be creating an instance of our own widget and showing it. Nothing special here. We can come back. But before we do anything, it is my habit to try and run the code to make sure that I have no problems in there. So let's do that. We should see an empty widget pop up, and it does here. Now, what we are going to do is set up our text edit component together with a bunch of buttons that will allow us to play with it. The first thing we do here, we are putting in a window title because this is a Q text edit demo. We set up our text edit. And if you go down, for now, you can ignore the connections we are doing here. The first thing we are interested in is laying things out so that we can see them in our user interface. We will talk about all these connections later. So we have a copy button, we have a cut button, we have a bunch of buttons all the way to the clear button here. Now that we have them, we need to lay them out. And the way we want to do things, we want all these buttons to show up in a horizontal layout that is going to be on top. So these are going to be our buttons. And below the buttons, we will be putting our text edit component. If I can draw it here. So this other big thing below is our text edit component. So this is going to be a horizontal layout. And this is going to be our text edit component. And they are going to be laid out in a vertical layout. So we will set up this horizontal layout and add horizontal layout to the vertical layout. After the horizontal layout is added, we will be adding our text edit component. I hope this makes sense. So let's go down and put in our layouts. We can do something like this. We will set up our horizontal layout, which is going to be an instance of QH box layout. After that, we will be adding our buttons, the copy, cut, paste, undo, redo, set plain text, set HTML, and clear. After that, we will set up the vertical layout, which is going to be containing our horizontal layout and the text edit. And notice that the text edit is set up as a member because of the self thing here. And we are doing this because we will be needing accessing this in a bunch of slots that we will set up later. Let's take out this connection because I think it might give us problems because we don't have this slot in yet. And now that we have the vertical layout, we can go below and say self set layout and pass in this vertical layout. I think with this, we will be able to run our user interface and be able to see our text edit component along with the buttons that we set up here. So let's clear properly and run the application. And what is the problem here? Set plain text. We don't have these guys yet. I think we have a connection that mentions set plain text. Let's comment this out because we don't have this in yet. And we can try to run again. And if we do, this is going to show up. And the meat of this lecture really is to play with the Q text edit component that we have down here. What you can do with it, you can type text. You can say the sky is blue. I am in my city, something like that. You can really do all you want. You can put in a lot of text. And this is what you can do with something like this. And you can see that using this as a basis, you can really set up something like the Notepad application you see in Windows here. You can do something like this. You see, it does exactly the same thing. Now that you know how to work with QMain window, you can set up a QMain window object and put in these files and menus and whatever. You can copy and edit. You can do all kinds of crazy things. You can see that now you even have the knowledge to be able to set up a status bar. You can set up toolbars. You can do all kinds of crazy things. So now that we have this in place, I think we need a way to play with this. So the first thing I am going to show you is that we can copy the text in here and paste it. But I think the most basic thing is to grab the text we have in our text edit component. But before we even do that, I forgot to tell you that you should use the documentation to learn about these things. So let's do Q text edit here. Okay, so we can come in here and look at this. And you can click on more, go down and learn all you can about this. Let's go to see the methods that this thing has. So we have clear, append, cut. We have a bunch of signals. We can play with this on this. And I think we have a method called to plain text we can use to get the current text in our text edit component here. That's what I was looking for. So what do we do? I think we need to add another button, unfortunately. So let's do that. I think it's going to be the first button. So we're going to say current text button. Okay, it's going to be a push button and it's going to say current text. So we can put it in and we're going to connect, click connect, and we want to set up a method that says current text button clicked. So we will go down and set up this method. This is the usual thing we do. We can go all the way to the bottom to the level of our constructor. We will define this method. It's going to be a member. We can say print the current text. So what do? We say self text edit to plain text. This is something that is going to print the current text in our text edit component here. And this is something we can do. So let's run and see this in action. And we can see this. And if we say the sky is blue, I love my city. We don't have the thing in the layout. So let's go back and add the current button as the first thing in our horizontal layout. We forgot that. No problem. We can fix that, add widget. And we're going to make this show up as the first thing in our horizontal layout. Now we can run. If we do and type the sky is blue and put in some other text here, if we get the current text, you see that we can see this. So we are able to grab the text in our component here. Now that we can see this, we can play with the copy method or the copy slot. If we go to the documentation for Q text edit, let's go to the top again and look at the slots that we have available on this component. We will see a copy slot, we can call it. And what it's going to do, it's going to copy any selected text to the clipboard. Any selected text from the Q text edit component here. Let's go down and play with this. So we can open this up in our editor, go to the point where we declare the copy button. And what this is going to do, it's going to call the copy slot. And this is what I meant when I said we can avoid to set up our own slot and immediately forward the work to copy to the copy slot of the text edit component. We can do it like we do here. So this is going to work right away. We can run the application. And if you go down, you see that we can also cut, because we are forwarding the cutting work to the cut slot of the text edit component here. Let's show our terminal, and we can do something like this and run. Now we can say the sky is blue. I think I don't need to type my text all the time. I think we can copy from the Qt documentation here to have some text show up in our text edit. We can paste here. So once we put in some text, we can select something and copy it. Okay, how do I know it's copied? It's going to be living on my clipboard. I can even paste this in another application. So let's open Notepad and paste. I am going to select and paste. You see that I am able to copy from my Qt application to another application. This is really cool. So let's cut, because the cut feature is also going to work, because again, it is forwarding the cutting work to the cut slot of our text edit component. If we cut, the text is going to go away. If we cut, the text is going to go away. If we cut, the text is going to go away, but we can't paste yet. Why? Because our paste button doesn't have a slot that can immediately paste connected. Let's do that to be able to really play with this. So we can say self text edit paste, and this is going to forward the work to the paste slot that we have available in our text edit component. Again, if you go to the top, you're going to see that we have a paste slot right here. Let's make sure it is highlighted so everybody can see it. You can see it right here. If you want, you can click on it and you can see all about this slot here. Let's go back to our application and clear and go up and run again. We can still copy from the Qt documentation. We can grab all this, no problem. So let's come back to our application and paste in. And if we want, we can, we can copy the entire thing here, and we can go below here and hit paste. And you see that we can paste text in here. And this is really cool. I can't tell you how excited I was the first time I could do this with Qt. But it wasn't with PySide at the time, it was with C++, but the excitement is the same. So we can copy, cut, and paste. Another thing I want you to see is that if you want, you can set up your own paste slot. So for example, we can say something like this. Okay, we will be calling our own paste slot. And if we set it up, we can copy and go down and set it up. We can say define paste, and it's going to be a method. Now, once we are in the body of this method, we can say self text edit and call the paste slot ourselves, because we can do that. This is something you can do, and it is going to behave exactly the same way. So let's do the paste button, make sure it is working. It should be. Let's go up and run. We can paste in code from what we have in the clipboard. We have something from our editor. I don't want that. So let's grab from the website here, and we can copy the entire thing. Okay, we click on the copy button here, and if we go down, we can paste. Okay, we can hit the paste button to paste. If we want, we can even cut. So we select something, we cut it out, it's going to go away. We select something else, we cut it out, it's going to go away. And we can keep pasting and really playing with this to have as much fun as we can with our application here. Another thing you can do is undo and redo. And I think, again, these are forwarding the work to undo to the slots in QTextEdit. If you go to undo, you see it here. If you look at redo, you can see it here. So I think we can even undo. If we hit undo, this is going to undo the operations we did before. If we redo, this is going to be redoing, and you can do something like this. Let's look at set plain text and set HTML. We have the connections in, but they are disabled because we don't have the correct slots implemented. Let's implement these slots here. So we can go all the way to the bottom and put these in, and let's take out the space here. Set plain text is going to call the set plain text method. So this is the method you can look up in the documentation, and we will just put in a bunch of text that I stole from somewhere. Set HTML can set HTML formatted text to your plain text edit component. And you see, I have a few things with a few HTML headers. We have the BR tag. We can set up a list, and you can see it right here. This is basic HTML if you happen to know something about HTML. Let's show the terminal, and we will play with that a little bit, and we can run. Okay, if we do set plain text, this is going to put in the text. If we say set HTML, you can see that our HTML is going to show up here. We have a header, we have an ordered list here, and we have something. This is something you can do in your application. Another thing you can do with Q text edit is to clear the text, and you do that by calling the clear slot that we have in our text edit component. If we go back to the documentation again, that's the best source of information for you. So let's look at the slots that we have. We have a clear slot, which is going to delete all the text in the text edit. Let's go back to our application and see that clear, the text goes away. Set plain text, clear, the text goes away. We can undo, we can redo, we can do all kinds of crazy things. This is really all I had to share in this lecture, showing you how you can play with Q text edit. Have as much fun as you can with this component. And then we are going to stop here, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to see another use for the Q label component, and that's using it to show an image. What we want to end up with is something like this. We will have a label component contained in our widget window, and that label is going to be displaying an image. Let's look at how we can do this. It's really simple. Here we have our class implementation. We will set up an image label. That's going to be the name of the variable. It's going to be a Q label component. And we will call the setPixMap method on it and give it the image that it is going to be displaying. This image is going to be living in our project under the images folder, and we will access it and display it in our label. Once we have the label, we will add it in a layout and apply the layout to our widget. And this is going to show the application that we see here. Now that you know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and do this. Here we are in our editor. We are going to be working in this folder here. If you look in, it is an empty folder. So let's drag and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code here, and we will do the usual, set up our main.python file. We're going to set up our widget file. And in our widget file, we will set up our class, which is going to be inheriting from QWidget. Let's make sure you see all the imports that we have here. We're going to be needing a lot of these. And we can go in our main file and put in our starter code, which is going to instantiate our widget object and show it. Nothing special here. Now that we have this, we can try and run it to make sure we have no problems. So let's do that, clear and run. This should give us an empty widget. And before we do anything, let's make sure that our image is in the folder. So what I am going to do, I am going to grab an image that I have lying on my drive here. I am going to hop over in my project that contains my main Python file and paste in that folder. I am going to share this project on GitHub, so you can download this project and grab this images folder and use it. Inside you will find my image here called minions, and it is a PNG file. Now that we have this, we can set up our label component. Let's go back to the widget file. We will set our window title in and set up our label component. That's what we are doing here. After we have this, we need to set a pixmap to our label. So let's go back to the label documentation. We can go back there. I really want you to see these things in the documentation. So let's do QLabel. And if we go to the documentation, it should have a setPixMap method. SetPixMap, do we have that? We have a pixmap method, which is going to give us the pixmap, which is really a representation of the image that is displayed in the level. But I can't find the setPixMap function. It's not shown here. Don't know why. We have it as a slot, so we have setPixMap here. And if we go in, okay, we see setPixMap. This property holds the label pixmap. Setting the pixmap clears any previous content, and you can see all the information here. So this is what we do with this. You can look at the QPixMap class itself. Let's go to the top. They say what this class does. It provides a way to show an image basically, and all the information here you can read if you want. For now, we are going to come back to our project and say image label set pixmap, and we will build a QPixmap object in place. And you build it by giving it a path to the image that it is going to be displaying. In our case, the image lives in the images folder, you can see here, and it is called minions.png. Let's do that, minion.png. And that's going to be our thing. Now what we need to do is to set up a layout. So we can say layout equals Q. You can use any kind of layout you want. Let's use QVBox layout. Why not? We will add, thanks to the layout, so we will be adding a widget that's going to be our image label. And after we do that, we will set the layout to be applied to our widget here. Set layout. This is the flow you have to drill in your mind if you want to work with layouts within your Qt widgets. Let's pass in our layout here, and I think we have everything we need, hopefully. Let's show our terminal window. What do we have here? The application is still running. We can kill it and clear and run again. And if we do, look at what we see here. We have our minions image showing up. And this is really how you use a label to display an image. And this is really all we set out to do. I hope you found this lecture interesting. We are going to stop here, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to look at Qt size policies and stretches. And this is a concept we use to decide how our widgets behave if the user interface grows or shrinks. We will start by talking about size policies, and a size policy is a property you can apply to your widget to decide how that widget is going to behave if the user interface grows or shrinks. For example, if we resize the englobing window here, we have the option to let the label here and the line edit grow at the same time. So the label is going to grow and the line edit is going to grow. Or we can choose to say the label is not going to grow, it's going to stay to the same width, but the line edit is going to grow, and we can control these things using size policies. I know this concept can be hard to grab, but you are going to see what this really means when we get to run this in Visual Studio Code in a minute. Another concept that I want to cover before we head over to the editor is the concept of stretch. And a stretch is a property that says how many units each widget is going to occupy in a layout. What do I mean here? If you look at our buttons.r in a horizontal layout, I set them up in a way that the button that says 1 has twice the width of 2 and 3 here. And you can set up by setting up a stretch. So what I really did, I said the button saying 1 here is going to have a stretch of 2. The 2 button is going to have a stretch of 1. The 3 button is going to have a stretch of 1. And at any point when the user interface grows horizontally, the button saying 1 is going to be occupying twice the size occupied by either of the other buttons. This is how you can say it using stretches, and you can use these concepts in your Qt application if you happen to need that. Here is the code that is going to allow us to do these things here. For example, we have our label, okay, and the line edit, and we can set the size policy. You can say, I want my widget to expand horizontally or vertically when the user interface that englobes my widget resizes. And if you want to expand horizontally, you pass that as the first parameter of the set method here. And if you want to expand vertically, you pass that as the second parameter here. In this case, we are saying we want to expand horizontally for the line edit, and we don't want to expand vertically. So vertically, we're going to be fixed. This is how you say it. If you want to be expanding in both directions, you can say it like we do here, and this is going to work. Down here, you see that we can do the same on the label component. You're going to see the behavior of this when we hit the editor in a minute. Down here, we have the layout, the usual thing you already know. Now we can look at stretches, and a stretch again is specifying how many units each component is going to be using in the layout. In the example I showed, I had an example where the first button occupied twice the space occupied by each other button here. So let's make sure I can at least try to visualize this. So suppose the first button here has 2 units. Okay, it occupies 2 units, and each other one is going to be occupying 1 unit. You specify your stretch as the second parameter to the add widget method. So we are saying that button 1 is going to have a stretch of 2, button 2 is going to have a stretch of 1, and button 3 is going to have a stretch of 1. And we can add these guys to the layout to show them in our user interface. Now that you know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and see this in action. Here we are in our editor, Visual Studio Code. We have an empty folder that we will be using for this project here. We can drag it and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code. Once we have this opened, we can create our files, the main Python file and the widget Python file. Once we have the widget Python file, we can put in our starter code. We have that right here, and we just set the window title on this. And we can head over to the main Python file and put in our code, which is going to import the components we need. We are going to set up our widget and we are going to show it. We can try to run this to make sure we have no problems. So let's show our terminal here and clear if I can type. And we can show the application. We have our widget here. Everything is working as expected. The first thing I am going to do is to set up my components so that I have my full user interface. Once we have it, we will play with size policies and stretches. So we have the label and the line edit. We will go down and set up the layout that is going to be containing our line edit and label. And this is nothing complicated. So what this is going to do is to set up a horizontal layout. And the horizontal layout is going to be containing our label and our line edit. This is what we want to do here. We also want to set up another layout, which is going to be containing 3 buttons. And these are going to be laid out like this. This is the goal we have using stretches. So the first button is going to be occupying twice the space occupied by the other buttons. Let's go down and put in the buttons. Let's put in the buttons here. I am going to paste them in to save on some typing time here. Button 1, button 2, button 3, and we will add them to their own layout. Once we have this, we will set up a vertical layout on which we will be adding these layouts here to have them on separate rows, each one being horizontal, if that is making any sense. Okay, we have our vertical layout. We can add in our horizontal layouts and we set the layout to the widget here. Okay, now that we have this, I think we can actually take out the second parameters for add widget here because we will add them when we want to play with stretches. For now, we want to see our user interface and I think we have it set up. Again, if you are confused, we have our label component, the line edit. We are laying them out horizontally. So the label is going to be to the left. The line edit is going to be to the right. After that, we set up our buttons. One is going to say 1, 2, and 3. They are going to be saying 1, 2, 3 here. And we laid the buttons in a horizontal layout as well. After that, we will be setting up a vertical layout, which is going to be containing those 2 layouts. Again, to the top, we will be having our line edit and our label. So the label is going to be to the left and the line edit is going to be to the right. Down below, we will have our buttons. So at this point, we don't have any stretch applied. So they will have the same size as I can roughly draw here. This is what we intend to see when we run the application. Let's go to View and Terminal. And we can run again. If we do, we should see our user interface. And let's try to play with it and see what is happening here. So if we resize the user interface horizontally, you see that the label, which is saying some text here, is not growing, but the line edit on top is occupying all the space. Down below, we can see that the buttons are all growing horizontally at the same rate. And this is the default behavior we have for buttons in a layout. Let's try to expand vertically and see what happens. You see the buttons don't expand and the line edit and the label don't expand vertically. So let's try to use size policies on the line edit to simulate the behavior we have by default. So what we can do is go to the line edit component here. We can say line edit set size policy, because this is the method that is going to be setting our size policy, and we can tell it Q size policy horizontally I want to expand. So it's going to be expanding horizontally, we can say it like this, but vertically it's going to be fixed. So let's do that. Q size policy fixed, you can say that here, and this is going to be simulating the default behavior we just experienced in a minute. Let's try to view and terminal and try to run. If we do and we try to expand horizontally, you see nothing changes because we are simulating the default. If we try to expand vertically, we're going to see that we're not going to expand vertically. But if we want, we can set the size policy fixed, even horizontal. Let's see what happens if we do that. So we're going to say fixed here. If I can type that, and we are going to run the application again. Now we have the application, and you see that if we expand horizontally, the line edit is going to have a fixed size. It's not going to grow whatsoever. And this is a setting you might want to do if this makes sense for whatever you are designing your user interface for. I am going to turn this back to expanding. But another weird thing I want you to see is that you can set your line edit to expand even vertical. So we're going to say expanding here, and if we try to run again, we will see that it will try to occupy as much space as possible vertically. We can shrink it, it's going to go down, but if we go up, we're going to see that it's going to be growing vertically, and it is still a line edit even if it doesn't look like so. So this is where you shouldn't really do that. I am doing this to show you the effects of size policies in your applications. Let's turn this back to fixed. You can also apply size policies to the label. For now, the label is not expanding either horizontally or vertically, but we can play with this and really make it to do weird things. So let's shift Alt down to copy the line. We're going to make this apply something on the label, and the label is going to be expanding as well horizontally because that's the setting we have here. Let's see what happens, and we can run. And it is label with lowercase. I think that's the problem here. Let's run again. Now it's going to run, and you see that the label now is occupying space. All this space you see down here, which is gray, is occupied by the label, and it is growing horizontally as well. We can also set it to grow vertically, but we're not going to do that. You can play with it if you want. My intent here is to show you how to use size policies to your advantage. And the main intent for size policies is to define how your widgets are going to behave when the user interface grows or shrinks. If the user interface grows, your widget may decide to grow horizontally or vertically, and you can control these properties using size policies. Now that we have this out of the way, we can focus on stretches. Stretches control how much space is occupied by each widget in the user interface. For example, if we run the application again, let's do that. We see that our buttons are occupying the same space. So you can say that each widget is really occupying 1 unit of space because they are all occupying the same space. To kind of simulate the default behavior we have, we can specify a stretch as a second parameter to the add widget method as we saw, but we will be using a stretch of 1. Okay, so the unit is going to be 1, and each of these widgets is going to be occupying the same space in the layout. This is something we can do. Let's kill the application here and run it again. You're going to see that it is going to be doing exactly the same thing. But now that we know about stretches, we can decide to choose one widget and tell it to occupy however many units we want. So the unit is 1, but we want the first widget to, for example, occupy 3 units. With this setting, button 2 is going to have 1 unit, button 3 is going to have 1 unit, but button 1 is going to have 3 units. Let's try and run. We expect button 1 to occupy 3 times the space occupied by button 2 and button 3. That's the setting we have here. And if our user interface grows, you see that that's going to be 3 times. If you measure this, you're going to find that out. I think it is easier to see it if we set button 1 to 2. So let's do that. And as we grow, now button 1 is occupying 2 times the space occupied by the other buttons here. You can see that right here. This is really all I had to share in this lecture, showing you how to play with size policies and stretches. Use this if it makes sense in your Qt applications. We will stop here in this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to look at the QGrid layout component in your Qt applications. And this is a component that allows you to lay out widgets in a grid. And it's really like a table. So you have a table here which has 3 rows and 3 columns, as you can see here. And the first thing here is going to have an index of 0, 0. So it's going to be at row 0, column 0. This is going to be at row 1, column 1. That should be this thing here. If you target this thing here, it should be at row 2, 0, 1, 2, and column 2. You use these kinds of indexes to target where you want your widget to show up in the grid layout. Now that you have the idea, let's see what we can achieve with this. In this lecture, we will be setting up a user interface like this. This is going to be a grid, but you see that we have the ability to tell a component to occupy more than 1 row or more than 1 column. And we do this with a property called row span or column span, and we do that in code as you see here. So here is an example. We have our buttons. We are setting them up button 1 all the way to button 7. We set up a grid layout component, and we specify the location where the buttons are going to live. For example, button 1 is going to be at 0, 0. So the first one is the row, the other one is the column. Button 2 is going to live at 0, 1. Button 3 is going to live at 1, 0. Button 4 is going to live at 1, 1. And all the way to button 7, which is going to be living at 2, 2. And you might be asking, what are these additional parameters you pass when you set up button 2 and button 3? Well, this is because we want to set up a structure like this. So suppose we have 3 rows and 3 columns. Let's try to do this as evenly as I can. And we want button 1 to occupy slot 0, 0. That's going to be this guy here, 0, 0. 0 row, 0 column. That's the meaning. And we have button 2 occupying 0, 1. So this is going to be button 2. But button 2 is going to occupy 1 row. Okay, the additional parameters are going to be specifying the row span and the column span. And this button is going to be spanning 1 row and 2 columns. So button 2 is going to show up throughout here. Okay, this is what we want to do. For button 3, it is going to be at index 1, 0. So that's going to be our 3 here. But it is going to take up 2 slots vertically. The row span is 2. That's what we see here. And down below, this should be 3, 2. If we go to button 4, it's going to take 1, 1. So 1, 1, that's going to be our button 4. And you can keep completing these things as you see. But the main idea is that button 2 is going to occupy 2 columns because we have 2 as the column span. And button 3 is going to occupy 2 rows because we have a row span of 2. Hopefully this is making some sense. And if you go to the top, you see that we are setting up a size policy for button 3 because we want it to expand in all directions to occupy as much space as possible. And that's going to allow us to have a user interface like this that we are after. Now that you know this, we can head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our editor. The current project is going to be living in this folder here, grid layout. We can grab it and drop it on the Visual Studio Code editor. And we are going to create our files, main.py as usual, and we want to do widget.py. Once we have this, we will put in our code for the widget. Usual stuff really. Make sure you see the imports we have here. You can't see them all, but we will be needing some of these. And we can head over to the main file and put in our starter code. Make sure this runs. So let's bring up terminal and run this. And we should see an empty widget. Now that we have this running, we can come back to our widget and actually set up our buttons. Remember the user interface we are after. We have a bunch of buttons. So we have button 1 all the way to button 7 here. They have names 1 through 7. And we are going to use a grid layout to show them in this widget here. So let's go down and make sure we set up our layout here. It is going to be a grid layout. To be able to use this, you need to have imported QGrid layout. I don't think we need the horizontal layout here. We don't need the vertical layout here. If we need them, we'll import them back. But if you have imports you don't need, you can take them out here. So do we need line edit? We don't, I think. Let's remove that. And we will need size policy in a minute. Okay, now we have the layout. And one thing I want you to see is that we specified the location where the widget is going to show up in our grid layout using indexes like this. So we have the row position and the column position. After that, you may also specify the row span like we do for button 2 and button 3. In this case, button 2 is going to take up 1 row and 2 columns. Button 3 is going to take up 2 rows and 1 column, and that's going to give us the user interface we want. Once we have this, we can set the layout to the current widget layout, and it's going to be grid layout. We can do that, and I think we can run the application and see our user interface in action. Let's go to View and Terminal and run. If we run, we will have our user interface. You can see that button 2 is taking up space for 2 columns, okay, and button 3 is taking up space for 2 rows. But we can't see this because we didn't instruct this button to expand in all spaces as much as it wants. So let's do that. We are going to go back to the code and enable this line that sets the size policy to expand in all directions. Once we do that, our button is going to expand and fill as much space as it can. And you can see that it is working to our advantage now. This is really all I had to share in this lecture, showing you how you can use grid layout. Use it if it makes sense in your Qt applications. We are going to stop here in this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to look at the Q checkbox and Q radio button components in your Qt applications. And these are things you use to let users choose options in your applications. For example, you may want your users to choose an operating system that they like, and you may want to give them the option to choose multiple choices. So you can let them, for example, choose Windows and Linux or either of these options. Another option is to let them only choose one. And if you want to do that, you may do something like this using radio buttons. If they choose one, the other is going to be disabled, and at any point they will only be able to choose one thing. So they can either choose A, B, or C, but they can't have A and B enabled at the same time. And this is what we call an exclusive button. If you want, you may also set up a checkbox to be exclusive, and I will show you how to do this in a minute. But this is what we are after in this lecture here. We will build a user interface like this using Q radio button and Q checkbox. Here is a simple example of how you can set up non-exclusive checkboxes in your application. And the main message I want to convey here is that if you want to group a bunch of checkboxes, you will put them in a group box. This is something very crucial to be able to work with these components. So we will set up a group box for the operating system. That's what I mean here. And we will set up our checkboxes. We have a Windows checkbox, we have a Linux checkbox, and we have a Mac checkbox. And we are doing some connections here to know when the user toggles the checkbox. But for now, let's worry about laying these things out. Once we have the group box, we will set up a layout that is going to be shown in our group box. And we will be adding these checkboxes to the layout. This is a bit convoluted, but this is really what we have to work with in Qt. So again, we have a group box, we have our checkboxes, and we will be adding the checkboxes to the layout that is going to be shown in our group box. So we will be adding the Windows, Linux, and Mac checkboxes to the layout. And after that, we will be applying this layout to our group box. This is what we do here. And once we do this, our group box is going to be kind of wrapping around our checkboxes and treating them as a single unit. You can move around if you want to do that. And we will see that we can add this group box to other layouts to really have a complex user interface in our Qt applications. Here you see the slots that we will be using to know when the user toggles our checkboxes. If they toggle the Windows checkbox, this method is going to be activated. If they toggle the Linux one, we will activate this. If they toggle the Mac one, we will activate this. Nothing special here. If we go down, we will see that we can also set up exclusive checkboxes. And the meat of this is to set up a button group. Again, that is going to be logically grouping these buttons together. And once you have this button group, you can say that you want them to be exclusive by calling set exclusive and passing in a true value. And this is going to make these buttons exclusive. Once you do this, you want to have the option to choose multiple options. Again, we may have something like this for checkboxes. And once they are exclusive, you can only have one checked. You can't have more than one selected, and that's the behavior you have with the exclusivity here. If you want the default exclusive behavior, you can use radio buttons. And again, they work the same. We can have our group box here. Once we do that, we set up our radio buttons. We will be adding the radio buttons to a layout, okay? And we will be applying this layout to the group box that we have here using the line here. Now that you know this, I think we can head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our editor. The folder we will be using is right here. So it is an empty folder. We can drag it and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code. This is going to open it up. We are creating our main Python file and the widget file. And we put in our starter code for the widget. We can head over to the main file and also put in our code. And let's see if this actually runs before we do anything else. This is my habit. If we run, we will have our empty widget and we can start doing our crazy things here. Let's come back to the widget. And remember, we are after a user interface like this. The first thing we're going to do is to set up this group of checkboxes. We can do that by coming up in our constructor and setting up that group. I am going to put in the code to save on some typing here, and I will do my best to explain this. So this is going to first set up a group box. Okay, as I said before, you can think of a group box as a container of checkboxes. Okay, in this case, we are interested in checkboxes. Suppose we have 3 checkboxes in here. We are going to put them in a group box, and it will be this group box that we move around. But to have it set up, we have to actually set up our checkboxes. That's what we do here. We have one for Windows, one for Linux, one for Mac. And once we have the checkboxes, we will set up a layout that is going to be within this group box here. So this is going to be our layout, and we will apply the layout to the group box. This is the setup we have here. Take a moment to really understand this. It is a bit convoluted, but once you understand this, it's going to be a piece of cake to work with checkboxes and radio buttons in your Qt applications. Okay, we have our checkbox, but we can't really see it yet. Let's see what I can do to be able to see this and increase the complexity of our user interface as we go. I think this is going to be a good exercise. What we can do is set up a layout. So let's say layout, and we are going to say QVBox layout. It's going to be a vertical layout. We will add our operating system group box to the layout, add widget. I want to get autocomplete here because I am lazy. So we want to add OS, which is a group box, and we want to set the layout to the current widget here. So we're going to say self set layout, and we want the layout applied. I think if we run, we should see our checkboxes showing on our user interface. So let's do this. We're going to show the terminal and run. And what do we have here? No attribute, Windows toggled. So we have connections that are not working yet. Let's comment these out because they are going to just give us a hard time here. And we can try to run again. And if we do, notice what we see. We have our group box and we have our checkboxes in. We can check them all if we want, or we can check 2, or we can check 1, because this is not exclusive, so you can have multiple ones selected. And once we have these, we may be interested in getting the information out of these guys. For example, if the user checks Windows, we want to do something in our application to take into account that the user chose the window checkbox here. And you can do that by connecting to the toggled signal. So we're going to set up these slots here. Let's activate these connections that we did here. And I think we can put a space in here to make it easier to read. And let's put in these implementations. So let's go all the way to the bottom where we have our constructor defined, and we are going to define our 2 or 3 method implementations. Notice that we have a parameter. How do I know we have a parameter? Well, I read the documentation for the signals for the checkbox. Let's go there to do this together so that you can really see what is going on here. Let's do Q checkbox, but it is the same thing you have for Q push button. So it's kind of a repetition here, but I am going to show you that anyway. If you look, you see that we don't have the signals, the same behavior we saw for the Q push button, but we can go to the parent class. And what this says is that really Q checkbox has a lot of things it shares with Q push button. It just happens to display differently, but because it inherits Q abstract button, it shares many behaviors with Q push button. I want you to keep that in mind. Let's go to Q abstract button. If we go to signals, we will see that we have a toggled signal that happens to send a parameter. And this is what we are going to catch and decide whether the radio button is checked or not checked. This is really cool. Let's come back to our code and we can look at our method here. If checked, we will show that it is checked. If it's not checked, we will say that it is unchecked. The same applies to Linux and Mac here. We have done the connections, so this should work if we run the application. Let's show our terminal window, clear, and take out all this garbage we have here. And we will run. If we check Windows, Windows is checked. If we uncheck, Windows is unchecked. Let's do the same for Linux. You see it works. Let's do the same for Mac. You see it works. This is really how you can process this information in your Qt applications. Now that we have this, we can set up an exclusive set of checkboxes. Let's go down and do that. And I think we can go down below here and say exclusive checkboxes. And this is going to be allowing the user to choose drinks. This is what we do as an example here. And what we do here, we will set up a group box. Okay, just like we did for checkboxes, and we will set up a beer checkbox, a juice checkbox, and a coffee checkbox. We will set the beer one checked by default. You can do this programmatically. I just left in this line to be able to show you this. And we will set up a logical grouping of these buttons so that we have the ability to set them to be exclusive. So this is how you make them exclusive. Once you have this, you will set up the layout like we did for the other checkboxes. We will add them to the layout and we will apply the layout to the drinks group box here. Once we have this, we can add this to our user interface, but we will have to change the layout a bit. For example, we can change this to be a horizontal layout. Okay, we can do this. And after this, we will add the other group box, which is going to be containing our drinks. Let's copy the name here because I tend to forget these things and mess up. So let's do layout, add widget, and we will be adding our drinks group box. If we run, we should see this showing up on our user interface. Let's do terminal and run. You see we have our drinks. And because this is an exclusive set of checkboxes, we can only choose one at a given time, unlike what we can do with the other one for the operating system. So you can choose whatever you want in your Qt applications. Let's show you how to work with radio buttons, and the behavior is really going to be the same. So we can go down and set up a set of radio buttons. Let's do that. I am going to go down here and do that. We have our radio buttons here. Again, we have a group box which is going to group them together. We set up the radio buttons. We set one to be checked by default. And we will set up a layout that is going to be applied to the group box. We add things to the layout and we apply the layout to our group box here. And if we want, we can add this to our, I think we put our code here in the wrong spot. So let's cut this out. We don't want to mess up our layout here. So we just go below the group for exclusive checkboxes and we will put our code in here. Sorry for that if it was confusing. And we will go down and add this to the layout. So we can say layout add widget, and that's going to be answers, I think. So let's do that. Answers. And if we run, okay, we can run the application. We will have our thing here. If we want, we can even achieve what we saw in the slides here. So all we have to do is set up a vertical layout and add the radio buttons to the bottom of the vertical layout. We can do that. We already know how to do that. Let's come back to our code. So what we need to do is to take this guy here out of our horizontal layout, and we will set up a vertical layout that is going to be the actual layout of the user interface. So let's say vLayout equals QV box layout, and we will name this horizontal layout to be self-descriptive here. I don't want the code to be confusing. Good names are really important. You should focus on that. Make sure the names describe what you are doing in your user interface. We have the vertical layout. So what we do with the vertical layout, we will add the horizontal layout. So let's do vLayout add layout, and we will be adding the H layout that we have set up in our code. And after this, we will be adding the answers group of radio buttons. So let's do vLayout add widget answers, and we will be setting vLayout as our layout here. I hope you can understand this. If you don't, please go back to the point where we talked about layouts in a bunch of widgets, or you can even ask me. I will do the best I can to help you out. Let's view our terminal, and we can clear and run. If we run, we will have our user interface. And ladies and gentlemen, this is what we set out to do in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. We are going to stop here in this one, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to look at the QList widget component. This is a component that allows you to lay out things in a list in a widget. So for example, you can set up a widget like this, and we have a list of things. We have 1, 2, 3. We can even add more, and we will see how to do that. And you can really use it if you need this kind of list in your user interface. In this lecture, we will see how to set it up. So we will set up a class and set up our widget. We will see how to add items. We will see how to remove items. We will see how to get how many items are in our list. We will see how to get selected items, and we will get a list of items and print them out to really give you a foundation on using this component in your own Qt applications. This is how we're going to set it up. We will have a list widget component, and this is going to be our variable. Once you have it, you can choose to set the selection mode. And what this really means is whether you allow users to only select a single item or to be able to select multiple items. And you can control this using this setting here. You can add items using the add item or add items method, and you can connect to a bunch of signals to know whether the current item has changed or whether the current text has changed. And you can check the documentation to see other signals that are offered by this component. Down below, we are setting up a bunch of buttons to be able to play with this component. And you can see that we can also set up a bunch of methods that are going to be triggered when we do things in our list widget. For example, this method is going to be triggered whenever the current item changes. We will be able to print the new current item. We will be able to respond when the current text changes. We will be able to call this method to add items, and really all these methods to do all kinds of crazy things. Now that you know this, we are going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with us a little more. Here we are in our editor. This is going to be our current project folder. It is empty, as you can see now. Let's drag it and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code here. This is going to open our project, and we can create our files. So we need the widget file. And we will put in our starter code, which is going to give us an empty widget with a title here. We can head over to the main file and put in the code that you are familiar with by now. And we can view our terminal to try and run the application to make sure this is working as we want. Let's run it. This should pop up our empty widget here. The first thing we want to do is to set up our list widget. And we have the needed components imported. If you go to the top here, you see that we are importing QList widget. We can go down and create a variable for this, which is going to be a member of this class here because of the self thing we are doing here. This is our list widget. We need to give it a parent. And we say that we want to be able to select multiple items using this setting here. Once we do that, we are going to add items. You can either add a single item using the add item method, as you see here, or you can use the add items method. Once we have this, I think we can set up a layout. Let's use a vertical layout. So we are going to say vLayout, QV box layout, and we are going to say vLayout, add widget. That's going to be self with list widget. And we will set this layout to be used by the current widget here. So we're going to say self set layout, and we will use vLayout here. And I think if we run, we will see our list widget with the 3 items of data that we have added. So let's view terminal and run this. And if we do this, you see that we have 1, 2, 3. And this is what you can do with a list widget. Now that we have this, we can connect to a bunch of signals from QList widget. But before we do that, I think it is a good idea to come back to the documentation. So let's say QList widget here, and we can look at what it has to offer. I do recommend reading as much as you can on this, especially if it is the first time you use this component here. So come to more, look at what you can do with it. If you go to the top, you're going to see a bunch of signals you can use if we can find them. You see we have a lot of signals that we can play with. We have a lot of slots we can play with. Make sure you look at those that interest you and read the documentation to really know what these things do. Let's come back to our application, and we will put in a bunch of connections here. Once we have the list widget set up, we will connect to the current item changed signal and the current text change signal. And if you want to know what these signals do, again, use the documentation to your advantage. Current item changed. Let's see what happens here. Current item changed. If we go to the signal, this property holds the row of the current item. They don't say anything about this signal here. And this is a bummer. This is really bad because Qt should say at least something about this, but they don't. This is going to be triggered when you change the current item in your list widget. If you wanted to see a good documentation for Qt, for example, if you think that the documentation for Qt for Python is lacking in some way, you can use the C++ documentation, and all you have to do is say QList widget and say Qt6, for example. This is going to give you the C++ documentation. Okay, I think I should have said this somewhere. I will update the course to be able to say that. So we have QList widget. If we go down, we see the properties. Let's look at the signals. Current item changed. And at least they say what the signal does. This is what I mean when I say that the Python documentation is still lacking. So if you want, you can use the C++ documentation like I do here, or you can use the Python documentation we have been using all along. Let's come back to our project, and we need to set up these methods that are going to be triggered when these signals are fired. We can go down and put in our method definitions. We can do that. We have current item changed, and you see the signal is going to give us the current item, the new item, if I can say it like that. And the current text changed signal is going to give us the new text. Let's try to run this and see what happens. So view terminal and run this. And I think the application is still running, but no big deal. We can run it again. Let's go to, okay, so let's run. And if we click on 1, this is the current item. If we click on 2, we see current item. And we can click on 3 to see the current item, and they tell you that the current item text has changed. So you can use these signals if you want in your Qt application. Okay, now that we have this working, we can add a bunch of buttons that will allow us to manipulate our list widget. For example, we might want to add a new item to get to the current item count and things like that. Let's do that. So we will create a bunch of buttons here. And I also put in the connections to be able to connect to the slots directly to save on some time. Once we have this, we will add these buttons to our layout. So let's do that. We will say vLayout, add widget, should type that, button, add item. This is the thing. We can copy this, Shift Alt down to copy the line. The other is going to be button, delete item. Let's do that. Delete item. We can copy again the line. That's going to be button item count, button item count. And the last one is going to be button selected items. And once we have this, we should see our buttons in the user interface. Let's see if we actually see them. View, terminal, run the application. And the button add item clicked connected self add item. What is going on here? We don't have the method implementations for the slots we are connecting to our signals. So I think it is a good time to add them here. So what we can do, we can come down to the bottom. And I think it is a good idea to actually separate these method definitions. Okay, so let's do that. This one is going to be triggered when we want to add a new item. And you can see how we are adding a new item. We are just calling the add item on our list widget component. If we want to get the item count, we call the count method on our list widget. If we want to delete an item, okay, we will call the take item method on our list widget, and we will give it the current row. Okay, and this is going to remove the currently selected item. This is how we are doing these things here. If you want, you can loop through all the selected items, and you get a list of selected items by calling the selected items method. And you can loop through this list, printing each item's text. This is how we do this. So let's try and run the application now. We can clear and run. Now the application is going to come up. Okay, if we add item, you see we are adding a new item. This guy is going to be triggered. Let me make sure you can see this. If we click delete item, this is going to delete the currently selected item. Let's make sure the currently selected item is 2 here. If we delete, 2 is going to go away. If we click, 1 is going to go away. And if we delete, new item is going to go away. And you see that we have a problem because now current item changed is not going to find the current item to print. So this is a problem you might want to fix, but we're not going to handle errors here. You can handle them in whatever way you usually handle errors in your Python applications. This is really all I had to share in this lecture, showing you how to use the list widget component. You can use it if you want to show a list of items in your widget applications. And you can check the documentation to see more things you can even do than I had a chance to tell you about in this lecture here. I am going to stop here in this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to look at the QTab widget component. This is a component that allows you to set up a user interface like this, in which you have multiple parts of your user interface that you want to toggle through. For example, here we have the same widget shown in 2 states. The first part is going to show this information here. The second part is going to show these buttons, but you can toggle between these by clicking on these titles here. So if you click on information, it is going to show this little widget. If you click on buttons, it is going to toggle to the state down here, and you are able to toggle between different parts of your user interface. This is good if you want to set up settings for your application, for example, and there are many uses for this kind of widget. We are going to see how to set it up in your Qt applications, and we will see how to add tabs and how to use components inside separate tabs. The first step to working with this is to create an instance of it in your Python application. So that's what we have right here. And after that, we will create our sub widgets, if I can call them like that. The first one is going to show information. It's going to be an instance of Q widget, and we will put things inside. Okay, so we have a label and we have a line edit, and we will set up a layout that is going to be containing this label and line edit as we do here, and we will apply the layout to our widget here. We also set up a bunch of buttons, so button 1 through button 3. We add the buttons to the layout and we set the layout to the widget here. Once we have these sub widgets, we will add them to our tab widget by calling the add tab method, as you see right here. Once we do that, we will specify the widget we want to add and the title information for that widget. Once we do that, we will set up a layout that is going to apply to our container widget, and we apply the layout to our widget here. And once we finish this setup, we can run the application and we will see something like this pop up. Now that we know this, we can head over to Visual Studio Code and actually do this. Okay, here we are in our Visual Studio Code editor. The project is going to be living in this folder here, 12Q tab widget. We can drag it and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code here. The first thing we want to do is to create our files. So that's going to be main.py, and the other one is going to be widget.py. Let's do that. We can go in our widget and set up our starter code for the class. It's going to be inheriting from QWidget as usual. Make sure you see the imports we have here. So these are the things we're going to be needing. Once we have this in, we can go to our main file and put in our starter code. If you don't want to type this code, you can copy from the resource section of the lecture. You're going to find the code here. You can even download from GitHub. If you want to have all the code for the course in one place on your local drive, you can use the course however you see fit. Let's go to terminal and run this. And we can run the main file. And this is going to give us an empty widget, on top of which we can start setting up our Q tab widget. Before we even do anything, I think it is a good idea to go to the documentation and look for Q tab widget, Q tab widget. So we can open it for Qt for Python here. And if you go to more, you're going to read all you can about this. Okay. So make sure you read this if it is the first time you use this component here. You can see it has a bunch of signals, it has a bunch of slots. You can really do all kinds of crazy things. Let's come back to our project here in our widget file, and we will set up our tab widget. So let's do tab widget equals Q tab widget, and we will pass a parent. After that, we will set up our sub widgets, just like we showed in the slides. So I am just going to put in the code here. First one is going to be information, which is going to take the full name of a person, and we will store that in the memory of our application. After we have the components set up, we are going to add them to a layout that we will then apply to our widget here. This is going to set up our widget here. We will set up another sub widget, which is going to be a widget containing a bunch of buttons, 1, 2, and 3. Here we are just connecting to the button to show you that you can respond to this clicked signal from this button. And once we have these guys, we can add them to our tab widget. So let's go down and do that. We are going to say add tabs to widget, and we will say tab widget, add tab. We can do that. You see that you can really add a lot of things. You can even add action. If you want to know what this method does, please use the documentation. For now, we will just add a tab, and the first one is going to be widget form. Let's do that. And the text is going to be information. We will add another one, tab widget, add tab, and that's going to be widget buttons. And we can say buttons here. You can really put in whatever text you want. So why do we have this squiggle here? It must be Visual Studio Code getting confused. Now that we have this, we will actually set up the layout. Let's do that. So layout equals QVBox layout. It's going to be a vertical layout because that's what I prefer. We will add things to the layout, and what we add is going to be, we need to put a comma here. Okay, let's make sure we do that. And we put in a closing double quote. Now we can do add widget, and add our tab widget. Once we do that, we will set the layout to be used by our entire widget here. So self set layout, and that's going to be our layout here. If we have this and run the application, we should see our tab widget. Let's make sure we view our terminal and make sure we can run this. But before we do, I know a problem we're going to have. We have a connection to a slot which we don't have defined yet. So let's go down and do that before we actually try to run. So def, we define the slot. It's going to be a member, and in the slot we print button clicked. We can do that. Now we can actually try to run the application. The code is going to autosave. Now you see we have our tab widget exactly like we saw in the slides. We can resize this if we want. This is going to be the minimum size by default. We can type in something, the first, let's say Jon Snow, or we can change to the other thing. Click on button 1. You see our slot is responding. If you want, you can also connect to these other buttons. But again, the main point is to show you how to use QTab widget in your Qt applications. And this concludes what I had to share in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to look at the Q combo box component. This is a component that allows for the user to choose between a selection of items, and it is easier to show it than to talk about it. So the component looks like this. When you click on this little icon, a list is going to pop up allowing the user to choose something. And if they choose something, that's going to be the current item in the combo box here. This is how you use it. You can get to the current item and use the data to do things in your Qt application. Let's see how you can set it up. And here is the code you created by using Q combo box, just like we do for other components. This is going to give us a variable that we can work with in our application. Once you have the variable, you can use it to add items to the combo box, and these are going to be the set of things the user can choose through. We will use a bunch of buttons to play with our combo box. For example, we can get to the current value. We can set a new value to the combo box. We will see how to do that. And this is really going to set the current value. And we will get the values in our combo box. We can do things like this. And down below, we have a bunch of buttons that are going to help us use this. And let's take a look at the slots that we will be using. To get to the current value, we will be calling the current text method. And we can also call the method to get the current index if you need that in your Qt application. We can also set the current item by passing in the index. So we will say the current item is the second item in the list, or the item that is at index 2. And because indexes start at 0, this is going to be the third item in the list. You need to be careful about this. If you want, you can even get all the values in your combo box. And here we set up a simple loop to loop through the items, printing each item at a given index in your combo box. Now that you know this, we can head over to Visual Studio Code and actually play with us. Here we are in our working folder. The current project is Q combo box. You can see that it is empty here. Let's drag it and drop it on top of Visual Studio Code, and we will create the files that we need. We have main.py, the Python file, the main Python file, and we have widget.py, and we will put in our starter code. We can also go in the main Python file and put in our main code. And once we do that, we can bring up our terminal window and try to run the application to see if we see our trusty empty widget here. We have it. Let's go back to widget here, and we will go down and set up our combo box. It is really nothing special. You already know how to do that from the slides. So we will create our combo box component. We are using self here because we want it to be a member of this class. And that's going to give us the ability to call it from methods, because we are using a bunch of methods here that are going to be manipulating our combo box. So let's do that. We have our thing here. Okay, now we have the combo box. We have a bunch of buttons that we can use to manipulate the combo box. Now we want to lay things out. So we will set up a layout and use that layout on this widget here. Let's go down and do that. We will use a vertical layout as we always do. Let's align this properly. So we will have our vertical layout. We will add our combo box. We will add our buttons, and we will set this layout as the layout for the current widget. Let's run and see view terminal like we always do. If we run, we should see our thing here. And now you can look at what a combo box is. It is this thing on top which says Earth. If we click on this down arrow, we will have an option to choose one of the planets here. For example, we can choose Mars, but we can also use these buttons to manipulate things in our combo box on top here. Let's put in the methods, and I am going to explain them one by one because now you are a master at using Qt. So many of these things I don't need to explain line by line by typing each one. So let's go down and put in our methods. The first method is going to be getting the current value, and it is going to be using a bunch of methods on the QComboBox class. Let's go to the documentation and actually show you the documentation for this. I really encourage you to use the documentation as much as you can. QComboBox, and we open this up. You can read more. You can see the methods, the slots, the signals you can use to play with us. You can really do all kinds of crazy things. Let's come back to our project. So you can look up current text and current index. We will use the set current index method to set the current index. And we can loop through the values in our combo box, printing the text and the current index we might be at in our loop. Let's view terminal and run the application to see this running. We will see our user interface here. And if we get the current value, and you see that the current value is Earth, we can select Mars, for example. If we print current value, it's going to say Mars at index 2. We can select Pluton. If we get current value, it's going to say the current value and the index. And we are able to do that because of the current value method we have set up here. We can set the current value to be something at index 2, and that's going to be Mars. If we get the current value, we're going to get Mars. We can print all the values we have in our thing and the indexes, and this is working exactly as we want. This is really all I had to share in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. We are going to stop here in this one, and I will see you next time. In this lecture, we're going to see a way you can design layouts and user interfaces without hard coding them in your Python code like we have been doing so far. And we will be using Qt Designer. Qt Designer is a tool that allows us to build user interfaces just by dragging and dropping components. And that's going to give us a cool user interface we can just import in our Python code and use it right away. The user interface is going to look something like this. This is just a simple introduction. We will have time to install this tool and see how to use it. But you can see the idea here. For example, to set up this button I did here, all I had to do was to drag and drop this UI component on my form here, and that's going to give me a form I can use. And you can see we can do all kinds of crazy things. On top here, you can see we can do a bunch of layouts. We can really build all kinds of crazy interfaces using Qt Designer. So this chapter is going to be about using Qt Designer. We will see how to install it. We will see how to create these UI files. And we will see different ways we have to import these user interface files into our PySide6 applications. And that's going to be really cool. Once you design your UI files, what you will get out of Qt Designer is a .ui file. And it is this kind of file that we will be importing in our PySide application. One thing you should know is that we have two ways to get access to Qt Designer. You can use the Qt Designer application that comes bundled into your Qt installation, or you can use Qt Creator. One thing I have to say, which is a bit inconvenient, is that we don't have immediate access to these tools when we install PySide like we have done so far. So what we will do in this lecture is install Qt, which is going to give us access to these design tools. We will install the C++ side of Qt. That's what we are going to install here, and that's going to give us access to Qt Designer and Qt Creator. To install Qt, all you have to do is come to your browser and say Qt download. That's going to give you a link looking something like this. Let's open it. Okay, once you are at the Qt website, you can see we are at qtio/download. Once you are here, you will click on download try. And on this page here, we can scroll all the way to the bottom and say download for open source users, because we are just interested in the open source version of Qt. So click on go open source here. And once you are on this page, you will scroll all the way to the bottom where it says download the Qt online installer, and you will click on this button. They are probably going to detect your operating system. Once they do, you will come all the way to this location here and hit download. And this should start downloading Qt for you. Okay, you can see that it is downloading for me, but I already have this. So all you need to do is to wait for this to download, open this file, and let it install Qt. Once you have that file downloaded, you will double click on it or click on it to start installing Qt. Once you do that, you will get a user interface like this asking you to log in. So if you don't have an account, you will create it. Once you have your account and your credentials, you will just hit next here, and you will go through a series of steps helping you install Qt. One thing I should say is that if you get a list of options telling you what you should install, make sure you click on custom installation. That's going to land you where we are about to go in a minute. I can't really show you the exact steps because I already have Qt installed on my system here, so I am going to do the best I can to guide you through this. But if you choose custom installation and then hit next, you are going to land in a place like this. Once you are here, I want you to click on Qt, and if you click on that, you are going to get a series of options. Make sure you choose the latest version. The latest version at the time of this recording is Qt 6.4.0. As you see here, that's what I am going to choose. I am going to expand it, and I am showing you the steps here for Windows, and they are going to be similar for Linux and Mac. Once you are here on Windows, you can either choose MinGW here or MSVC. I do recommend using MinGW because it is hassle-free. It's going to be easier to install this. If you use MSVC here, you will need to have the Microsoft Visual Studio IDE installed. So if you don't want the Visual Studio thing, just use MinGW here. It is going to give you everything you need. If you are on Linux, you are probably going to see a GCC version here. If you are on a Mac, you are going to see something saying Clang or whatever. So make sure you check one, just like I have MinGW checked here. And you are going to click on this button that says next or install or something. Once you do that, you will keep hitting next until you start installing. You will wait for Qt to be installed. And at the end, you will have a Qt installation on your system. One thing I should say is that mine is installed in C Qt, which is going to be the default suggested by Qt. So after you install Qt, you will have a Qt folder in your C drive or wherever you instructed the installer to install your Qt files on your system. Okay, once you have it installed, on your start menu, you will have an option to start Qt Creator. You can see I can start it here. Let's start it and show you how it looks. Okay, this is how Qt Creator is going to look. If you start it up, you can do all kinds of crazy things, but at this moment we are interested in using Qt Designer, which is bundled into Qt Creator. If you start Qt Designer, we also have the option to start it. Let's say Designer, and if we do, we will have Designer, whatever the version you have installed. So if we start it, we will have it pop up on our screen and we can start using it. And this concludes what we set out to do in this lecture here, introducing Qt Designer and showing you different ways you can have access to it. You can either use Qt Designer or Qt Creator, and we were able to get access to these things by installing Qt just like we did in this lecture here. We are going to stop here in this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to see how to work with Qt Designer. And we have access to this because we installed Qt in the last lecture, which gave us access to either Qt Designer or Qt Creator. What we will be doing in this lecture is to try and create a user interface like this. It's a simple form allowing the user to type in their full name and occupation. Once they do that, they can click on the submit button, and we can grab all this information and use that in our Python application or a PySide application, whatever you might want to call. And once you have this information, you can use that in your PySide application. So let's start Qt Designer. To start it, you come to your start menu, whatever start menu you have on your operating system. We can type Qt or Designer. I think that's going to give us access to this. Once you start it, it should show up like this. It is going to show you a window that lets you create a form. We may choose not to use this because I want to show you around. So I am going to click close on that. And what I want you to see is that we will be storing our files into this folder in our source code saying using Qt Designer. So make sure you have a location where you will save your user interface files. And to create a new form, all you have to do is come to File, New, and you see this is going to give us back that user interface we had. So let's see the options we have down here. So we can create a dialog with buttons at the bottom. We can create a dialog with buttons to the right. We can create a dialog without buttons, or we can create a main window or a widget. You can see that we can create a lot of things. I think I am going to go for the dialog without buttons because we will be putting in our own button. Remember the design we are going after. It is something like this. So this is just going to be an empty form, a dialog without buttons, on top of which we will be building our own user interface. Let's come back to Designer. Okay, we're going to choose this. So let's click the 8. Make sure you have dialog without buttons selected here, and you will click on create here. So let's come back. It's going now. Dialog without buttons, create. This is going to create our file. And once you have this thing created, we don't want to create a dialog for what we want, because if you go back to our user interface here, this is not a dialog really. We want this to be some kind of widget. So let's go back and make sure we create a widget, because it is important which class you start by. So let's discard the changes that we had, and we want to create a widget. Sorry for that. Make sure you create a widget here and come back here and say create. That's going to give you a widget. And one thing that is really important when you create your user interface files like this is to remember the object name for your top level widget here. And in this case, you can see that it is called form. We want to go back and call this widget just like I did here. Make sure you name yours widget, and we can start doing our thing. If you remember, we have a bunch of labels and line edits in our user interface that we are after here. You can see that the thing we have on the left here is a label, and this thing is a line edit, and it is the same on the second line here, and this is a button. Let's make sure we add these things into our designer user interface. If you want to search for a component, you can type the name here. We are looking for a label. So you see, if we type label here, we're going to get label. We can drag 2 labels because I think we just need 2. You can close here by clicking on the X. That's to the right of this component here. And down below, we can grab a button and put it on our user interface. We also need a line edit. Let's type line edit, and you see we have it right here. We can drag one here, and we can drag another one here, and we have everything we need in our user interface. We can name these things. So let's say full name. Okay, we can type in whatever we want, and the other one is going to say occupation, if I remember correctly. Down here we are going to say submit in the text, and I am just double clicking in these components to have the ability to type text, so nothing really complicated here. And now that I have my components here, the next important thing is to name the components that I think I will be using on the Python side of my application here. And I will be using these line edits and the submit button. So the user will be able to type text in here, and I want to be able to grab that text on the Python side And I want to know when the user clicks on this submit button here. So let's name our things. I am going to click on either of these and come to object name in my properties to the right here. So this one is going to be named full name, line edit. Okay, so the other one is going to be occupation line edit. And the other thing I need to name is my submit button. Okay, make sure you remember these names, and at any point you can open this file here and look at this. If you click, you're going to see the object name to the right in the tuple here, so you can see your object name here. If we click the other one, we can see our object name right here. If we click on the button, we can see our object name right here. And as I said before, make sure you name your top level widget. In this case, it is named widget here. And this is going to be important when we get to the point where we load this on our Python side. So this is really important. Once we have this user interface, I think we need to put in a bunch of layouts. And it is really easy to use layouts from Qt Designer. For example, we want the full name and the line edit here to be laid out horizontally. So we can click on full name and our line edit while having control selected. So we can select them all, or we can even click and drag and make sure we have them selected here. We can do something like this. Once you have them selected, you can come to the top here where you have these buttons. The first one is going to help you lay things out horizontally. The second one is going to help you lay things out vertically. We want to lay out horizontally, so we can hover over this button. You see it says layout horizontally. If we click on it, these guys are going to be aligned horizontally in a layout. We are going to do the same for occupation, and the line edit to the right of that, we are going to put them in a horizontal layout. And we want to click on the form here and lay everything out vertically, because that's the user interface we are after. So click somewhere empty on the form, come to the button that says lay out vertically. If you click on it, things are going to be laid out vertically, and we can resize our user interface to make it really look nice here. I think this is good. And we have our user interface. So you can come to file and save it. And you are going to choose the location where you want to save yours. Okay, this is where we want to save our file. We will give it a name. Let's name it widget.ui. We can do something like this. And if we save, it is going to be saved. And we are done with our design of our user interface here. Okay, now that we are done with this, we are going to head over in the next lecture and show you how you can do the same from Qt Creator. And after that, we will worry about importing this user interface for use in your PySide application. And that's going to be really cool. So I will see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to look at how we can load our user interface files into a Python application. There are different ways to do this, as I mentioned in a previous lecture probably, but we will be looking at a class called GUI loader, which helps us do that. Let's go to the documentation and actually see what this class does. You can come to your search engine and say PySide6 GUI loader. If I can type today, this is going to give us a link we can click on. And if we go there, we're going to learn all we can about this class here. They show a little example of how you can use this. We will be running a version of this example in our PySide application, but make sure you read about this class to know what it does. Let's come back to the slides and really look at how to use this. So to use this class, you have to make sure you have imported GUI loader like we are doing here. Once you do that, you will create a loader object, just like we do here. Once you have a loader object, all you have to do to load your UI file is to call the load method, just like we are doing here. So the first parameter is going to be your UI file. And what this says is that in this example here, we will be putting our Python file in the same location as our user interface file. If your user interface file lives in another folder, you will have to tell your Python file to go to that location and find the UI file. That's something you need to know. And once we call the load method here, we will get a widget that we can then use in our application like we use any other widget. Another thing worth mentioning is that to access things into our UI file, we will be using the notation here. Notice that we are saying full name line edit because it is the name we used in our UI file. Remember, the object name, that's the name you have to use here. And then we say dot and access properties of this UI component. You see we are doing the same for our occupation line edit to access the text. Another thing we can do is connect slots to signals coming from the user interface. For example, here, you see that we are saying whenever somebody clicks on the submit button in our window object, we want to respond in our do something slot that we have defined on top here. And once you have this, you will show the window, you will call the exec method to kick off the event loop, and your application is going to show up and do things. One thing I wanted to warn you about is that the loading that we are doing here is happening at runtime. And what that means is that your application will be paying a performance penalty every time the user runs your application. That's why I am really not in favor of using GUI loader to load your user interface files, because the penalty is going to be on your users and you will be wasting their time. There is a better way to do this, and I will show that in the next few lectures. But for now, you need to be aware of GUI loader. I think GUI loader can be useful if you are prototyping and things like that, but in a production application, you shouldn't really use this. At least that's my opinion here. Okay, make sure that you know that GUI loader is going to make your users pay the price every time the application runs. Now that you know this, we are going to head over into our editor and play with us a little more. Okay, here we are in our editor, which is Visual Studio Code. This is the folder where we will be doing our things here. The first thing I want to do is to make sure that I put my UI file in this project here. We can either use the one from Qt Designer or Qt Creator. Let's grab the one from Qt Creator. Doesn't really make a difference. They are the same. So I am going to put in my UI file. And once I do that, I will open this project in Visual Studio Code. Let's do that. Okay, the project is opened. You can see that we have our UI file. What we want to do is to create our main Py file. The first thing we want to do is to make sure we import the components we need. And we import Qt widgets because we will be using a widget that GUI loader is going to load. We create our loader object, nothing special here. Next, we go down and create our application instance. So it's going to be a Q application object that we call app here. We will have a widget or a window that we get by loading our user interface file. It is not called user data UI, it is called widget.ui. So let's make sure we correct this a little bit. Once we call the load method, this is going to give us a widget that we can manipulate in our application here. We can go down and define the function that is going to respond when the user manipulates things in our user interface. So this is our do something function. Again, it is going through our window object to access the components we have in our designer form. Let's make sure we open designer because we still have this opened in Qt Creator. So if we go to the line edit, again, you can come to the object name here and see the object name. This is what we will be accessing from our Python application. So let's make sure we know that. Let's close out of Qt Creator here. And we are setting up our window title on our window object. And hopefully this proves that this is a real widget that we can manipulate like we have been manipulating the widgets that we have created ourselves. And this is really cool. Okay, let's go down and finish this up. We will connect and respond when the submit button is clicked. Then we will show our widget here and kick off the event loop. So the real meat of this is where we create our loader object. This is how you create it. And the other thing is where we load our widget UI file, and that's the line here. Once we call the load method, we will be getting a window object, which is really a widget. And we can do things we are used to do on other widgets. For example, we can set a window title. We can access things using the dot notation like we do here. And this is really cool. Now that we have this, we can actually try and run the application here. Let's show a terminal window like we always do. Hopefully this is going to work. It's not going to blow up in our face. Fingers crossed. And we can go up and try to run our Python file. And look at this. Look at what we have here. Full name, occupation. Let's put in Daniel Gray for our full name. Occupation, let's say I am a farmer. And if I hit submit, Daniel Gray is a farmer. Let's say I am a plumber. Submit, Daniel Gray is a plumber. And this is really cool. We are able to use our UI file from our Python file. But again, every time the user runs the application, notice what's going to happen. You know, this widget UI file is going to be transformed into Python, and Python is going to be loaded into this file here. All of that machinery is going to be really going on when your application runs. And this is going to make your users pay a performance penalty whenever they run your application. So this is really not good. But you need to be aware of this in case you have a logical use case for this. This is really all I had to share in this lecture. I hope you found it useful. Before I go, make sure you remember your object names. It is through these object names you go to access components from your UI file in your Python application here. And this is really cool. In the next lecture, we will try to reorganize this code in a separate file to make it really easy to manage and play with this a little more. So I will see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to reorganize our code using GUI loader and export that into a separate class so that our main Python file is a bit cleaner. We're not going to do anything special really. It is the same thing we did in the last lecture, but here is our loader object that we create in a separate file. We will set up a class that we call user interface that is going to be inheriting QObject because we need to connect signals to slots. That's why we need to do this. And then in our constructor, we will be doing our loading. We will set up a UI object that you see here, which is a member of this class. This is really going to be a widget that we get by calling the load method like we did in the last lecture. Once we do that, we set our window title, we do our connection to the button, and we set up our slot that is going to respond. And this is really all we need to do here. Another thing is that we have a show method that we are going to call to make this user interface show up. Nothing special here. Once we have this class, we will import it in our main Python file. You see, we are creating an object of it like we do here, and we are showing it. And once we create it, the wiring to the actual UI file is going to be done in the constructor. By the time we call the show method here, the entire window is going to be set up and we will see it pop up on our screen. Nothing really special here. We are just reorganizing what we already had in the last lecture. But let's head over to our editor and actually do this. Okay, here we are in our editor. We will be working in this folder here. You can see that it is empty. Before we do, let's head over to the lecture where we created our widget file and steal it and put a copy of that in our current folder here. Once we have this, we will open this up in Visual Studio Code and we will create our main Python file. So let's make sure we do that. Okay, plus main.py. We also need the user interface file. Let's say user interface.py, which is going to be doing the heavy lifting in bringing in our user interface file that we got from Qt Designer. In this case, I am just going to paste in the class because you already know most of these things. We will be importing GUI loader. Once we have it imported, we will go in our constructor and load our user interface file. In this case, our user interface file is named widget.ui. Okay, so make sure you correct this a little bit. We will give it a window title. We will make the connection to the button that is coming from our user interface file. Again, we know it is named submit button because that's what we set up in our designer file. So let's bring up designer because I think I really need to show you this. Okay, let's close out of this and we will open our current location, we go in, we can drag our widget file and drop that on top of designer. If we go to the submit button, its object name is submit button, just like you see here. It is this exact name that we have to load in our Python file. So this is submit button. If we go back in designer, submit button. If you go to the full name, line edit, the object name is right here. So if we come back to our file, we should be using that exact object name in our file. Make sure you really follow this. If you mess these names up, you're going to be in for a lot of trouble. Now that we have this, we can head over in our main Python file. So let's do that. Okay, we can put in the code and we will be importing PySide6 and we will be importing our user interface class from our user interface file. Once we have all these in, we create our application object. We will create our window and it is going to be an object of our user interface class. This line is going to trigger a call to the constructor that we have here. And the constructor is going to be doing the heavy lifting to load our widget UI file and give us an object called UI that we can manipulate in our application here. Again, the loading here is still happening at runtime. Make sure you know this. This is going to incur a performance penalty to your users, and you don't really want to do that unless you have a really good reason to use this way of loading your user interface files. Now that we have this, I think we can try to run the application and see how it behaves. We can show our terminal and we can clear. And if we run our Python file, we should see our thing here exactly like we did in the last lecture. If we put in our full name and our occupation, let's say we are farmer, submit. We have farmer. If we put in plumber, just like we did in the last lecture, we will get the same thing. And this is really all we set out to do in this lecture. Now that you know how to use GUI loader, we will head over in the next lecture and show you how we can actually compile our user interface file into Python code. And that's going to really take the performance penalty and put that on you, the developer. So you will take your user interface files and turn them into Python file, and your users will be loading those Python files when they run the application, and that's going to be much better. Let's head over to the next lecture and do that. In this lecture, we are going to see how to compile our user interface files into Python code that we can directly import in our Python project. And the command to do that is really simple. It is what you see here. We have a tool that we have access to because we installed PySide6. The tool is called PySide6-UIC. Once you call it, you will give it your widget user interface file, and you got this file from designer or Qt creator. You will put in this arrow, and then you will specify the output file name. And the convention I like to use is to say UI dash and say the name of the file that I got from designer or Qt creator. So in this case, it's going to be UI-widget.py file. And this is going to be the file that we get out of this user interface compiler. You can see UIC stands for user interface compiler. So if we run our designer file in UIC here, we will get a file named exactly like this. And this is a convention I use to make it easy for me to manage these files, especially if you have a really big project. It can be really hard to keep track of this. So make sure you understand this naming convention. Once you understand it, you can modify it to suit your own needs. Another thing I would like to warn you about is to remember the name of the top level widget you have in your user interface file. In our case, we named that widget exactly like this. And when we do that, the user interface compiler is going to generate a class that we can then load in our own Python code. And the convention the UIC compiler uses is to say UI-widget. This is going to be the name of the class. And this is what we will try to manipulate in our own Python code. And make sure you really drill this in your brain, because if you don't, you are going to have mismatching names either in your user interface code or in your Python code. Make sure these things match up. Another thing I noticed when using this in Visual Studio Code is that the files that I get out of my user interface compiler were encoded in UTF-16, and Visual Studio Code would not understand these. I will show you how to bypass this, but I just want you to be aware of this if you face this problem here. And if you are using a different editor, you might have to do research on how to get around these problems. And again, make sure you remember the convention we are using here. The widget.ui file is going to be what we get from Qt Designer or Qt Creator, the design file. Once we pass that file into the user interface compiler, we will get a UI-widget.py file. This is a file generated by the user interface compiler. You have no business manipulating manually. And our widget.py file is going to be our own class, which is going to be trying to reuse code that was generated for us by the user interface compiler. Make sure you really understand this convention. I will be going through this convention again when we hit Visual Studio Code in a minute, but I just want you to be aware of this. Once we have our file generated, we will set up our own widget class like this. And again, this is just a simple widget we are creating. This is our own class name. It is going to be inheriting both QWidget and UI widget. UI widget is the class that the user interface compiler is going to generate from your UI file. Again, this is going to work because our top level widget that contains our user interface is named widget. Let's go back to Designer and actually show you that. I think we still have Designer opened. If you manage to click around on the englobing form here, you will see that our object name is widget. And the user interface compiler is going to pick this up and generate a class that is named UI widget. And it is what we are trying to inherit from here. I really want you to notice this. If you have problems with this, it might be really hard to debug. So once we have inherited the correct class, we will go in our constructor. And because we are inheriting from UI widget, we have the things that UI widget has. And those things are our submit button. We can access it like this. Our full name line edit, we can access it like this. And our occupation line edit, and we can access it like this. Again, we know the object names because they are what we set up in our designer file. Let's make sure we open this in Designer. If we go to the full name line edit, the object name is right here. If we go to the occupation line edit, the object name is right here. If we go to the submit button, the object name is going to be right here for everybody to see. Make sure you really know these things. I don't want you to face problems if you went through this course to learn about PySide6. Okay, once we have things set up, we will also set up our slot, which is going to respond when the user clicks on our button. And the connection is going to make sure that whenever somebody clicks on the button, we will be calling this slot here. Nothing complicated so far. And one benefit of doing this is that this is going to be making it easy for your users. You went through the trouble to transform your user interface files into Python, and the user is not going to be paying that price. You, the developer, will be paying that price. And it is really good because you develop your application once, and your users will probably be running the application 1,000 times or even 1,000,000 times, depending on how successful your application is. So if you move the price at the developer time, you will be really saving your users a lot of time. With the GUI loader, every instance of your application that runs would pay that price. But now we are paying that price once when we develop the application. That's the benefit of doing things this way. Okay, now that you know this, we can head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our project. This is going to be our project folder here. It is empty. So what we need to do is to steal the UI file that we will be using for this demo here. So let's put this in place. And I think we can directly open this in Visual Studio Code. So let's drag this and drop on top of our editor here. This is going to give us our project. We need to create a few files. Remember our naming convention. We need a Python file, which is going to be the main Python file. Let's do that. We will also need to set up a widget.py file, which is what is going to be importing things generated by our user interface compiler. Now that we have the UI file, the first thing we need to do is to compile it to Python. You already know the command because we saw it in our slides, but I am going to show that again right here. So let's show our terminal and make sure you see everything here. Let's clear. I am going to paste in the command, but you can type it if you want. The command says PySide6-UIC. After that, we will specify the input file, which is going to be our user interface file that we have here in our folder. We will specify an angle bracket facing right. This is how you use this tool. And you can say the output file right here. In our case, it is going to be ui-widget.py. Once you have this typed in correctly, you can hit enter. The tool is going to go to work and it is going to generate a ui-widget.py file that you see generated here. If you want, you can even open this in Visual Studio Code. So let's make sure we click on it and you can see the things that are generated for you by the user interface compiler. They say that this file was created by the Qt user interface compiler. This is the version. They warn you that changes to this file may be lost the next time the user interface compiler is run, but you can browse through it. It is really a simple class. It's just doing the heavy lifting of generating these layouts and things for you so that you don't have to worry about it. If you go in, you will see our object names. For example, you see full name line edit. We see occupation line edit. If we go down, I think we will find our button. And these are things we will be loading in our Python code. One thing I want you to notice though is that this was generated in a UTF-16 encoding. Visual Studio Code is using UTF-8. If I try to run this, I will be into problems. So I will fix this in a minute when I show you the problem, but I just want you to notice this here. Okay, we have our UI widget py file. Again, in the naming convention we are using, files we name like this are going to be what we get as output from the user interface compiler. Files we name like widget.py like this are going to be our own code that uses what we got from the user interface compiler. Make sure you really understand this. And widget.ui is going to be the file we got from UI Designer. I know this may be confusing, but once you do this a couple of times, this is going to become second nature. Let's set up our own widget.py file. And I am just going to paste that in here because I don't want to waste your time typing this. It is going to be a class that inherits both QWidget and UI widget. This is super important. We set up our constructor, which is going to call the setUI method. And this is a way Qt provides to wire to the class that was generated for you. You don't have to worry too much about this. Just make sure you put in this call. Once you do that, you will have access to everything we had in our user interface file. For example, we can set up the window title because this is a widget. We can access the submit button like this. We use the self thing here because now that's part of us because we are inheriting from UI widget. And UI widget is named like this because our object name is widget. The top level widget is named widget. If we go back to designer, that's what we should see here. Let's click on the top level widget. Again, make sure you see this object name here. This is important. This has to match what you have after the UI dash here. This is how the user interface compiler is going to do things. So once we have everything, we will set up our slot and everything is really going to work. Once we have this, we can go to our main.python file and we will put in the code, which is not going to be anything new. So we will create our application object. We will create an instance of our own widget. This is really important. So notice the class is named widget. We are creating an instance of it. And this is going to show our user interface because we did the wiring in the constructor of our widget class here. Now that you have all this done, we can try to run the application, and I warn you, it's not going to work at this point, but let's try to do that. So we can say Python main.py, and if we try to do that, we will have an error. What is it saying? Source code string cannot contain null bytes, and this is happening because our UI widget py file was generated in an encoding that is different from the one that is being used by Visual Studio Code here. So what we need to do in our case, we can click on this UTF-16 thing down below. Once we do, we will have a menu on top here in Visual Studio Code. And what I want you to do is to click on Save with Encoding. And we will be using UTF-8 here. Once you do that, the thing below here, make sure you see this, is going to change to UTF-8. And now if we run the application, it should work. Let's come down, clear, and run our thing. And now it is working. We are able to compile our user interface code into Python code and loading that Python code in our own application. And this is really cool. We can put in our full name to make sure that our connection to slots and signals are working. Daniel Gray, occupation is going to be a farmer. And if we submit, you see he is a farmer. If we change to plumber, he is going to be a plumber. And this is working exactly like we want. And again, the meat of this is to be able to call the user interface compiler. The command is what we have here. Make sure you remember it or have it typed somewhere where you are able to access it easily. Once you have your Python code generated, make sure it is in the correct encoding, at least if you are using Visual Studio Code. Once you have it in the correct encoding, you can import the code in your widget.py file and create your class like we do here. Once you have your class, you will do the necessary connections to manipulate the user interface components. Remember, these are the objects names we have in our designer file. Once you have your class, you will create objects of it and you will play with it however you want. We are going to stop here in this lecture and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to look at how to use the Qt resource system. And this is a powerful system that allows us to bundle files into our Python application so that they can be found easily without having to need to put them where our main Python binary or script is. And we will explain this concept using this little application here. So we will have a minus button and a plus button. When you click on minus, we will decrease the number that we have here. When you click on plus, we will increment the number. And this is going to be a spin box component. I don't think we had a chance to talk about it, but you're going to see it as we go in this chapter here. The main point is to be able to load the icons for minus and plus here from our Qt resource system. In this lecture, we will be doing things manually from Qt Designer to show you how to work with this. And here is a simple piece of text saying the same thing I just said here. But one thing you should keep in your mind is that the files in your resource files are going to be compiled into Python code. And that's why it is possible to directly find them where your main Python script is without having to need to browse through the file system where your Python code is running. And this is really important. But again, it's going to incur a price on you, the developer, to have to compile your resource file into Python code. And you're going to see that it is really easy. We use a Qt resource compiler, and it's really easy. You just have to call the command and you will get a Python file that you can then load into your PySide project. The workflow we will be using here is to create the resource file. Of course, you also need to create your user interface files you're going to be needing. We will compile the resource into Python code. We will import the Python resource file into our own Python application, and we will be using that in our application here. Here I am showing you how we will be doing this in Designer. So once you have Designer opened, you will click on this button here. This is going to pop up this little widget. In this widget, you can create a resource file using the menu here, and you can add files to that resource using the menu here. I will show you how to do this in a minute when we hit our Designer instance. Once you have your resource file created, the file is going to be named resource.qrc. This is an extension that Designer understands, Qt Designer, I should say. And you will run this command, PySide6-rcc. You will give it the resource file. You will say that your output file name is resource_rc.py. And it is important to follow this naming convention because other tools like Qt Designer are going to be looking for it. So make sure if your file is resource to name the output Python file resource_rc. You basically have to add an _rc on this thing here, and this is going to work. Once you have your Python file that you generate, you will need to import that in your Python project. And all you need to do is say something like this, and you will be able to use it. Notice that this is our own class named widget. It's going to be inheriting from our UI widget file, and it will be accessing the buttons. So we are making connections to our buttons, just like you see here. And we will be setting icons to these buttons. And you see we set up the icons like this. And the meat of this is what we do here to access our images. Notice the syntax we use, :/images \++. This is because our images are going to be living in a folder named images. And once you follow this convention here, everything is going to work. We have the plus icon, we can set it to our button, and our user interface is going to show up exactly like we want. Okay, now that you know this, we are going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our project. The project we work on is going to be 7, Resource Manual Designer. And this is where we're going to be playing with this. The first thing we need to do is to create our user interface in Designer. So let's make sure we have Designer opened. Open it if it's not opened for you. And we will be creating a new project or a new file. It's going to be based off widget here. So let's create. This is going to create our user interface. We will be creating our user interface a lot of times here because you need to be familiar with us. So let's do this. We need 2 buttons. The first one is going to be on the left. The other one is going to be to the right. We need a spin box, and we will be using a regular spin box. Why not? We will have the button to the left named minus button. So we need to change the object name here. And we name the other one plus button. Okay, the one on the left is minus. We can change the text. Let's say minus and say plus to the right here. Let's look at the object name for our spin box. It is named spin box. Let's name it spin box with an underscore because this is our naming convention. And make sure the object name for the top level widget is widget because this is our convention here. Widget. And we have our user interface. I think we can apply a horizontal layout immediately by clicking on the empty form and clicking this button here. And we can resize this, okay, to something like this. And we have our application here. Okay, we have our file here. We can save it. Let's say file save. And we will browse to a location where we would like to save this. It is in our project here. So we will name it resource or widget.ui, not resource, sorry for that. So we save this on our drive and we have this thing saved. Once we have this saved, we will also create a resource file and we can close this. No, we don't need to close it because we need an active resource file to be able to create our resource file. This is unfortunate in a Designer. So let's open this again. We can go where we saved it. Sorry if this is a bit convoluted, but it is what we have to work with. So let's bring this back. Once we have this created, we can head over to our Designer. We will have a little button like this. Okay, make sure you see this. I am going to click on it. It is going to pop up another window. And on the left here, we have the option to create new resource files. So let's click on this button here that says new resource file. It's going to browse into my system where I want to save my resource file. I am going to choose this location here and name it resource.qrc. I think the extension is going to be put in automatically. When I save, the file is going to be saved. If I go back to my location, I am going to have my file. Where is it? Where did I put that file? Let's try to hit OK and see if this is actually going to save my resource file or I put it in the wrong location. Yes, we have the file here because we closed that. So it must be Designer that was having problems saving my resource file. Now that I have the resource file created, I can move over to the right here, okay, and add a prefix. A prefix is really like a logical grouping of files into your resource system. For now, don't worry too much about this. Click on Add Prefix and take out everything to have a default prefix that is to the root of where your resource file is. That's what we are doing here. So let's hit enter. This is going to give us a no prefix then. And once we have a prefix, we can add new files. I am going to click on Add Files, and this is going to browse to my location. I can go in my images folder. Don't worry, I will be giving you this images folder. You can use it in your project. You can actually download the source code and you will get that as part of what you download. Select everything here and open. And these things are going to be added in your resource file. Once you hit OK, you will see that these files are going to show up to the right here. And you can right click and copy path. Okay, and this is going to give you a path that you can use in your Python code. So let's make sure we open Notepad and paste that here so that you can see it. You can see the path we will be using in our Python code. Okay, now we have two things. We have a user interface file that we need to compile into Python. We also have a resource file that we need to compile into Python. Now we can come out of the editor, the designer editor, and come back to Visual Studio Code. And what do? We can go to where our project is, number 7 here, and we can load it into Visual Studio Code. And the first thing we need to do is to compile our user interface. Let's view and show the terminal. I think we still have our command to compile our widget UI into Python. It is right here. I just got it by hitting up. If you don't have it, you can type it. If I run, it's going to compile my Python file that you see here. And remember to turn this to UTF-8 if you are using Visual Studio Code. So let's do that. You already done this from the last lecture. So we are ready to do this. And we need to compile our resource file into Python as well. Again, I will be giving you the command here. I am going to paste it in PySide6-rcc. You get this as part of your PySide6 installation, and I will give it the resource file you need to compile. You will say -o and say the output file name. The naming like this is important because your other tooling like Designer are going to be looking for it. So make sure that you attach an _rc to whatever name you have for your resource file here. And once you have this, you can hit enter. This is going to compile the file. This is the output Python file. You can see that this is binary representation for the files that we have in our resource file. Now that we have these things, we can actually create our Python files. We will need a main Python file, main.py, as usual. We also need a widget.py file. I will put in my widget.py file immediately here because I don't want to type all this. You can type this if you want, but you can also download the source code and use it as is here. The main point is that you know how to work with resource files in your Python applications. So notice that we have a squiggle because our widget file starts with an underscore. Okay, so UI widget.py, that's what we are importing from. We will create our own widget, which is going to inherit Q widget and UI widget. We will set up our window title. We will access our plus button and minus button. And we will be setting up our slots that are going to respond whenever something changes in our spin box. Let's change this to say self spin box, because I think we named our thing using, let's go back and open recent forms. That's going to be widget UI. And our spin box is named using underscores. Make sure you don't mix these things up. So spin underscore box, that's the name. Spin underscore box. That's going to be our thing here. And whenever you click on plus, we will be incrementing the value in our spin box. Whenever you click on minus, we will be decrementing the value in our spin box. That's what we are doing here. But the main thing is that we are setting up an icon that is using things in our resource file. And we are able to do this because we imported our resource underscore RC file that we got as a result of compiling our resource file into Python. Make sure you really understand this. Now that we have this, we can create our main Python file, and it is not going to do anything special. It is just going to import things from our widget file, which is named with an underscore. Let's make sure we change that. And we will set up our application object, we will create our widget, and we will show it, and everything should work at this point here. Before we do, let's make sure that our UI widget py file is in UTF-8. It is. So let's try to run this. We are going to go to view and show terminal, and we can go down and go up, up, up until we see our command to run the code. And let's see what we have here. We have a mismatch for a spin box with camel case here. Where is it? In our widget py file, line 12. So let's go there. Widget.py, line 12 is trying to use the wrong name for our spin box. Let's make sure we fix this. And let's try to run again. View terminal. And we can clear and try to run. And if we run, you see our application is up here. If we click on plus, and we still have problems with our spin box. Sorry for this, but it is something you come across, so no problem here. The important thing is that we can fix it. Spin box. And let's make sure we run again. Clear and run. It's going to run. If we click plus, we are going to increment. If we click on minus, we are going to decrement, and everything is working. And the meat of this is to be able to load these files from your resource system. And some of you might think, why go through the trouble to use the resource system? It is really important because you don't have to provide these files where your main Python file is if you deploy this application to your users. And this is really important. Make sure you take advantage of this in your PySide applications. We are going to stop here in this lecture, and I will see you in the next one, where we're going to be using Qt Creator to create these resource files here. So I will see you there. In this lecture, we are going to see how to use resources in the Qt resource system from your user interface files. And this is going to save us from doing what we did here, for example, by having to manually set the icons to buttons. We can avoid this kind of thing and do it right from our user interface files. In this case, we will be using Designer. So let's head over to Visual Studio Code and actually set up a project that is going to help us do that. And another thing I should point out is that you don't even have to manually import this file in your Python project, because you will have done this from the user interface file. But make sure that you still have your resource file compiled into Python, because the UI file is going to be looking for that. And it will be looking for a naming convention like this from your resource files. So let's head over to Visual Studio Code and do this. Okay, here we are in our editor. We will be loading resources from our user interface file, and we will be working in this folder here. I think we can steal code from the last project and use that as our starting point here. Okay, we have the UI file and the resource file. We also need these images. So let's copy that and put that in our 9 project here. Once we have this, we can bring this into Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. And what we want to do is to go to our Python file and take out the import we are doing here. We don't need this anymore. And we don't need to set the resources like we are doing here because our user interface file is going to take care of that. So let's open our designer file, and again, make sure that you do this once you have a resource file like the resources.qrc file. We will open our user interface file in designer. So let's make sure we have designer up and running, designer, and we can run it. And we will hop over to the current project on my file system, number 9, and drag and drop the design file here. So once I have this, I can click on this button and I will have a bunch of properties for this button here. But before I do that, let's make sure that I have a resource file applied to this UI file. So what I can do is come to add a resource file. Let's open a resource file that is already existing. So I am going to browse to the location of my project here on my system. Let's do that. Let's go there, designer number 9. That's the current project. And we have a resource file that we can open here. Let's open. If we open it, it's going to show the images that it has, and this is going to work just fine. Let's hit OK. And once we do that, we will be seeing our images, and the current UI file is ready to start pulling resources from this resource file here. That's why we need to do this connection here. Once we have this, we can click on our minus button. I think we will have an icon property. We can even search by going to the top here and say icon. Okay, we will find icon here. And once we have icon, we can click to the right here, click on the 3 dots. Now we don't need to click on the 3 dots. We can click on the downward arrow here and we can choose resource. Once we do that, we're going to click on images and we can click minus. Once we do that, the minus icon is going to show up. We're going to repeat the same process on the plus button. Click on the down arrow, choose resource, click on images, and on the right here, you can choose plus. And this is working because we made the connection between the widget UI file and the resource file that we have in our path here. Once we have this, we can save. So let's save this again. And because we just changed our user interface file, we need to recompile this into Python. And this is something I want you to be aware of. Every time you change things in your user interface files, you need to recompile them into Python files so that the Python side of your application can pick up those changes. So let's come back to Visual Studio Code. We can really close out of Qt Designer here. We don't need this anymore. We can come back to Visual Studio Code, view our terminal, okay? And we can clear and go up to compile our user interface file into our Python file, and we will be using the user interface compiler. Notice that we don't even need to recompile the resource file because we already had that. But if you don't have a resource file, or if it is the first time you set up your resource file, you will need to compile that into Python code. I am going to show you why in a minute once we see our newly generated UI widget.py file. If we go there, the first thing I want you to notice is that the encoding has changed back to UTF-16 because this is a newly generated file. So let's make sure we go back and change this back to UTF-8. Okay, we need to do that. And another thing I want you to see is that this file is going to be doing the import for you because it is the one that is doing the setting of the icons on our buttons. So make sure you still have your resource file compiled into Python code and make sure you use this naming convention here. You see that Qt Designer or the user interface compiler, to be exact, is looking for this, and you need to follow this convention for things to fall in place and work. So our Python file should be clean now. It is not importing things, it is not setting icons, but our application should still work. Let's go to view, terminal, and clear and run. If we run, we should see this coming up here. If we click on plus, it's going to increment. If we click on minus, it is going to decrement, and everything is working as we want. This is really all I wanted you to see in this lecture, how to connect your user interface files with the resource files. Make sure that whenever you change something in the user interface file, you recompile to Python for the Python side of your application to pick up the changes and use them. I am going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, I will show you how to do the same from Qt Creator. I'll see you there. In this lecture, we are going to design a slightly involved QMain window application, which is going to be using resources intensively. We're going to have a chance to play with the menus and toolbars, and we will be able to use the images that are coming from a resource file that is going to be attached to our user interface file. We're going to be building something like this. So this is going to be our application here. You can see that we have a bunch of menus, we have a toolbar here, and we are using icons that we will be pulling from our resource file. Down in the middle, this is going to be a central widget for our main window, and it is going to be a text edit component. And we will set up this entire user interface in Qt Designer and use it in Visual Studio Code on the Python side. So let's do this. Here we are in our working folder. We will be working in this folder number 11. You can see that it is an empty folder. The first thing we want to do is to open Qt Designer and actually set up our user interface in this place here. Let's do that, Qt Designer. And it is going to be a main window project that we want to set up. So make sure you select main window here and create. And this is going to give us a main window that we can play with. Make sure you know the name of the top level widget. In this case, it's going to be named main window. This is okay. And we want to add a bunch of menus just like we saw. So we can say file here by clicking and typing. Let's look at our design. We have a file, edit, and help. Let's do that. We're going to say edit and help. Let's see what we have in our file menu. In the file menu, we will have a quit action. So let's put in quit. Okay, and you can see that when you double click on the place that says type here, you're going to be adding in an action. Let's go to edit. We will put in copy, cut, paste. We can undo, but before we do, let's add a separator and then undo and redo. In help, we can say about and about Qt. I am going to show you how to pop up a bunch of dialogues that show information here. And I think we have our user interface. If we come down, I think we can say add toolbar. This is going to give us a place where we can drag and drop things. So let's go down here in the user interface where it says action editor. And in here, we can actually add a bunch of actions. So you can see that we already have many actions. So we have action quit, copy, cut, and paste. What we want to do is but before we add icons to these actions, we actually needed to add a resource file. So let's go to resource browser here and click. You already know how to add a resource. We will be adding a new resource file to this project. It's going to be saved in, let's go somewhere on our drive here. 11 here, that's the folder. The name of the file is going to be resource, nothing complicated here, .qrc, and that's going to be our resource. I am going to copy a folder of images that I will be using in this project here. It is going to be available once you download the source code for this lecture here. So let's go in the current project and add in our images folder, and we can come back to Designer. And once we have the resource, we will be needing to add a prefix. Click on add prefix here, take out everything like we did earlier, and now you can add files. If we go in images, we are going to select everything and add all these files here. And if we hit OK, these files should now be available for use in the project here. Now we can come back to the action editor and double click on action quit. If we do, we will have the option to set an icon. Let's choose resource and go in images. and we will choose the quit icon here. So let's hit OK. And if we do OK again, the icon is going to show up. Let's do the same for copy. Let's choose resource, images, copy. Where is the copy icon? It is right here. So let's select that, hit OK. We are going to go to cat and do the same, choose resource, images, cat icon. That's what we want, and hit OK. We want to paste, choose resource, images, paste, and OK. We want undo, resource, images, undo. Where is undo? Undo is right here. Let's select it and hit OK. We want to redo, resource, images, redo icon. After that, we have about. Let's click OK first. About. Let's go choose resource, images, about. That's going to be this icon here, which is black. We hit OK. And about Qt, let's go to icon, choose resource, images, and about Qt, the orange one, and we can hit OK. Now that we have this, we can actually drag and drop actions on the toolbar. And this is going to be really cool. You see it shows up here. You can right click and say add separator. Okay, and then we can do copy, cat, and paste. Okay, this is something we can do. Once we do this, we can even add another separator. Okay, and after we do that, we are going to do undo and redo. Okay, we can do something like this. Another thing we can do is to add the text edit component. Okay, we can drag it and drop it here, and we can click in some empty space and use a vertical layout, for example, to make the text edit fill our user interface. And at this point, I really think we have everything we need for our user interface file. And because it is automatically loading the resources, we don't need to manually import the resource file. All we need to do is compile our user interface to Python, compile the resource to Python, and we will be able to set up a main window Python file that is going to be using these things on the Visual Studio Code side or the PySide side, if I can say it like that. So let's save this file here. Let's save, and we will be given the option to choose where we want to save it. It is going to go where we are saving other files. So let's go to that location and choose this guy. The name is going to be main window in lowercase .ui. And if we save, it should be available in our current working folder. We have the resource file, we have the main window file. We can close out of Designer if we want. But for now, what we want to do is to load this guy into Visual Studio Code. So that's going to be our project here. So let's drag and drop inside of Visual Studio Code. We will have our thing here. And we want to compile these guys. So let's show a terminal window. And we can hit up to go into our command history. We will see how to compile our user interface file. We just need to change the name here. I am going to change this to main window, to UI main window. Main window. This is what we want. If I do this, this is going to generate my main window file. Let's go up again and try to find the one to compile the resource file. We have a resource.qrc. We don't really need to change anything here. This is going to compile our file. We need to go to the main window Python file and change the encoding to UTF-8 if you remember correctly. So let's change this to UTF-8. And now we have everything we need. We can start creating our Python files. We can create the main Python file. We can also create the main window Python file. And now that we have this, and what we will do is just put in the code to use our generated Python file, main window, or UI underscore main window py file. We are importing the file here, and we are going to be inheriting from that file as we do here. In the constructor, we do really nothing special here. We are just taking an application parameter, and that's going to be what we use to kill the application when the user triggers the quit action. And down here, you see that we do connections to our actions. So we say action quit. When it's triggered, we are going to quit the application. When the action to copy is triggered, we will be running our copy slot, which is what we have here. And we do all these connections here. There is really nothing special. And in about, we will be putting out a message box that is going to say something. That is just going to be saying something here. And when the user triggers the about Qt action, what we will do is show a message from our Q application class here. This is something you can do. The main thing here is really to be able to build your user interface from Designer and be able to bring those files into use in your PySide application like we are doing here in Visual Studio Code. Now that we have our main window, we can go to the main Python file and bring everything together. Nothing complicated. We are just importing our main window file, the main window class that is in there. We are creating an object of it and showing it and kicking off the event loop here. Again, let's make sure that we compiled our resource. It is. We compiled our UI main window Python file. It is using UTF-8. This looks good. Let's show our terminal and try to run the application. And if we are lucky, everything is going to work and it is going to be really cool. Let's try to run. Okay, so it seems we don't have an action named about underscore Qt. Let's go back to our designer file and make sure that our action is named about Qt. Yes, it is named about Qt. And it seems we are doing something bad in our main window Python file. So let's go about Qt. Let's take out the underscore. Let's try to run again. Terminal, clear. If we try to run, now it is going to run. If we quit, we should be able to quit the application. If we run it again, we should be able to see it. You see, we see our icons in our toolbar. If we go to file and quit, it is going to go away. You already know how to work with QMain window, by the way. If we edit, we can copy, cut, paste, undo, redo. And for example, we can DDD here, undo. It's going to go away. We can copy. Let's say the sky is blue. We can copy this through the toolbar. And we can even paste and paste and paste and paste. This is going to work. We can undo. It's going to go away. We can redo. It's going to come back. We can even cut out everything here and paste. You see, we are really able to use this application, and this is really cool. Let's use the help menu. About, it's going to show a message box that we triggered in our code. If we do about Qt, it is going to show information about the Qt version that was used to compile this application. This is really cool, and this is all we set out to do in this lecture, showing you a slightly practical way to use the resource system to your advantage. And again, this is going to be really cool because all these resource files are going to be available to our application without having to recopy these images when you deploy your application. And this is really cool. I am going to stop here in this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. Congratulations on hitting the end of the course here. You have learned a lot in terms of using Qt for Python to build Qt widgets applications that you can run on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Now that you have these fundamentals, you may be asking, what's next? Well, you just scratched the surface when it comes to using Qt widgets to build applications that can run on different platforms. And a few other topics I would recommend is learning about events, the graphics view framework, which allows you to build interactive applications. This is actually one of my favorite topics in Qt. You can learn about networking, you can learn about databases, you can learn about threads. There is really no shortage of things you can learn about in Qt. Another thing you can learn about is QML, which is another API to build graphical user interfaces that are fluid and dynamic to run on mobile and embedded. This is a really hot topic in Qt, and I would recommend taking at least a moment to look at this, because if you are serious about Qt, you are probably going to run into QML. So that's something you might want to look at. We have a few courses on QML. If you are interested, you can check them out. And really, what I would recommend is to try and think about things that interest you the most, or things you think that you are likely to meet in your career as a developer. Focus on those things, learn how to do those things in Qt, and your learning experience is going to be much better. This is really all I had to share in this lecture. Again, congratulations on hitting the end. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be your instructor. If you are interested in many of our other courses, be sure to check them out. I am going to stop here in this lecture, and I will see you next time.